What up, people? I got a slightly different kind of video. I want to take a look at graphics cards because I'm super into them and I think they're cool as heck. This is one of my favorite graphics cards here, the Vega 64. Um, I think HBM memory is kind of cool. Like, there's a couple different reasons it's one of my favorites. I've got it in an older PC. I've got like a 990X equivalent, which is like a first gen core um, like extreme part or whatever. It's got 6 cores, 12 threads. And this thing came out in it's like 2010 or something like that. So it's a beast of a part, and amazingly, the thing still holds water. It still actually performs really well, and it pairs well with this Vega 64. And man, do I feel like the graphics card market is it's kind of in a funky situation right now. Like, I mean, especially from I want to say like 2 years ago or something when the 4000 series came out. I feel like people didn't realize it, but we were actually at like a really good point in the card prices and availability and different kinds of stuff like that. So, man, without treading through all the history of it, let's just take a look at some of the relative performance with kind of this as the baseline. And so I want to scroll back up here. So the card that I started out with is way up here, way up here. It was a GTX 550 Ti, one of these guys here. So 13% the relative performance of a Vega 64. So, just like, with a lot of with CPUs too to some extent, but just computing in general, there were like leaps and bounds in the technology. You know what I mean? Where like upgrading year by year was kind of like a big deal, or especially going from like a 60 class to an 80 class. You really felt it, and for the games of the time, the demands of the time. I'm sorry you had to see a little cat butt there, but they've got them. Anyways, so yeah, like that was, yeah, so yeah, we started off here with the 550 Ti, and then the next card I had after that was a 670. And so we'll scroll up the chart here and we'll see how much of a jump the 670 was over that. So here's a 660 Ti, and so there's the 680. So here's the 670. So you can see that just from that like I said, generational jump, which I actually missed out. The 600 series wasn't the really the good one to get. The 700 series, which came out like literally a year later, was much better and has held up much better too. But I didn't know that. I'm not a mind reader fortune teller, so I bought a 670 and I paid $400 for it, like 400 and some tax if I remember right. And I still have that card. And yeah, I use those in SLI actually because that I never really had the chance to use like a high-end SLI setup, so I bought another one for 80 bucks, I guess probably in like 2015 or something like that, which I guess around that time was like the crypto craze, and all the RX 580s and all like the cards a person would want were kind of getting used for those types of reasons. So I guess it wasn't the worst thing to do, but yeah, it was kind of an odd maneuver going into the future. Moving on though, the next card I had after that was 1060 3 gigabyte, which I don't even know if they really have it listed here. They've got the 6 gigabyte listed, so we'll just take that as a baseline. So already right here, by the time we're getting to the 1066 gigabyte, we're kind of moving into what was maybe 3 or 4 years ago the like average of performance. This was what the majority of people had on Steam. This was like a card that games were kind of built around. It was a card that had relative performance to, you know, not like the PS5 or yeah, PS5 and Xbox Series X, I think it is. I'm not super big into consoles, so I might get some of those wrong, but like that was a huge card. And you can see how you got all these cards based around its relative performance, which I this is something that we're gonna see again and again kind of throughout this chart at these different points. You know what I mean? As we move the average of performance up over the years. So yeah, so the Titan that has the relative performance of a 1060, actually a little bit less. So people who paid the $1,000 for the Titan, that became a much more affordable card. I guess it would have been like maybe four years down the road or 5 years down the road or something like that. And even here you see the 690, which I don't think it was $1,000, which is actually kind of crazy that the 690 is that performant. Like honestly, just absolutely crazy that the 690 is that performant. And it definitely, the dual GPU thing was cool. It was cool. You know what I mean? And the shrouds for the 600 series, oh, they were like they brought in the Titan series. They were that pre-Titan goodness. You know what I mean? Um, but anyways, so yeah, so we've got here in that same relative ballpark the 580, the venerable 580 that people recommended for a very very long time. Won't really recommend it anymore. Not really for anything but esports games. It's going to struggle to play if it will even allow you to play some modern titles. And then yeah, down here we got 5500 XT. These supposed to be mainstream cards. The 980, 1650 Super. So now we're gonna go up a little bit more, and so we're gonna see that the 1660 Super and these cards, they were in a really good spot for a bit because they were more relative performance than you needed from down here in the chart, which is where things were kind of at the average. So you were above average there, but now they've fallen into a weird middle ground where they're not really enough for modern games with only 6 gigabytes, and it's like they might have enough processor clocks, but yeah, they're just low on the VRAM, and they're getting a little long in the tooth now. And up here now we're getting to the Vega 64. And this is kind of another, what's become the modern bottom end of performance, the 2060 Super type mark. You know what I mean? And that makes sense because here we have a more modern card. This came out pretty recently. It's a A580. You know what I mean? That was supposed to be the mainstream ARC card, and they brought it out at the relative mainstream performance of, the 1080 and the Vega 64 and the 5500 XT and stuff like that. So we're seeing that, and then we're moving into a kind of weird middle ground here again, where we've got the 1080 Ti, the Radeon 7. These were considered like overpowered cards for a long time, and here right next to it, Intel once again reading the market, trying to slot in this relative performance area. They got the A770, and here you have the 2070 Super, which was an extremely popular card on the used market, or became an extremely popular card because of its relative performance to cards like the 66, the 7600 and the 4060, you know. And yeah, and that's another reason why people were really disappointed with the 4060, was because it felt low. Like people's expectations were kind of continually increasing. They forgot that the chart started all the way down here only but just a few years ago. You know what I mean? And that only but like 2 years ago, the relative performance was over here. And then all of a sudden it's like the 5700 XT, 3060, ARC A580, and then it moves on, and then it's like your 4060 is only a 2080 equivalent, and that seems really disappointing. You know what I mean? Yeah, you got your B580 right here, 3060 Ti. This has kind of become a new mid-tier performance. In the modern market, it's kind of falling off, but and like I said, that's why people considered the 4060 a really disappointing card, is because they already felt like it was in a position in the market that was falling off. And one of the reasons is because video games are just becoming extremely demanding, especially with the monitors that we have nowadays and how affordable they are. And that's something too that I haven't really touched on, but that's really really relevant to this chart, because different parts of this chart, like here down in the like the 2070 Super, you're probably still good at 1080 with a card like a 2070 Super. Maybe that 8 gigs is going to be a bottleneck in some games, but not near as bad as 6 gigabytes. And the amount of cards that have that odd 10 or 12, they're kind of fewer and farther between. But as time moves on, we are going to see things move away from 8 gigabytes, and that's why cards like the 3070, even though they're, let's see here, where's that 3070 at? 2080 Super, 4060. So yeah, we got 3070 right here. Yeah. So, cards like the 3070, despite their relatively high performance, are worse than a 2080 Ti in many ways just because of the VRAM. Um, and they're not really going to have a strong place in the future market, except maybe on like they might become sweetheart cards for esports games, is what I would say, because they're fast cards with just less VRAM. And so any game that needs less VRAM but you want high frames for and you want a cheap card, I think that 3070s are going to become a good card for that, but probably not right now because the when the 4000 series came out, it pushed all the used prices down. And when the market dried up, and then the new cards came out and everything was kind of relatively more expensive and scalpers and everything like that, then all the used prices kind of crept back up. So I haven't really seen good prices. I would be looking for maybe around 200, 250 at the most to be paying for one of those 3070s. That's kind of the direction I'd like to see the market move. But let's kind of move on. And so here we're getting into more of like what we're thinking of like mainstream high end. So we've got 7800 XT, we've got 4070, we've got 6800 XT, we've got 69 4070 Super, 3090 now slots into this area, and this is because of 1440p monitors. This is because of very demanding games. All these things are kind of pushing people. If you want to experience PC gaming in all of its glory on the monitor that you bought, your 1440p OLED, whatever you've got, and you want high frame rates, it's going to take a lot to get there. Like, the relative performance of the Vega 64 is still like a 1080p card, but when you're here down looking at the 3090, that's what I've got in my main PC. That's 262 more percent of performance. And in my experience, they actually get really, really similar frames just between 4K and 1080p at mostly the same settings in a lot of different games. There's some games, like I was trying out Space Marine 2 recently between the two PCs, completely playable between the two PCs. Between the 990X equivalent with the Vega 64, I was getting like lows of 47. And on this PC, with a 5950 and a 3090, I'm getting like lows of 70 or something like that. So I mean, that is a pretty big gap, but when you're just playing the game, it's fine. Like it's relatively fine. Once you become accustomed to fancy graphics and 4K and everything like that, you're like, oh, this is worse. But like, can you play the game? Yes. Does it still look pretty? Yes, it does, So it's just the kind of standards that we've set for ourselves and, what we want to see. So yeah, we got the 5070 brand new card, upper tier card that is here now relative to the 3090. And so we're starting to see a difference in how this chart's playing itself out. When we saw the beginning of the chart, there was these massive leaps between the relative performance of the cards by the generations and by the card type you were getting, and it was kind of competitive. I mean, they were fighting tooth and nail every generation to come out ahead of each other, and we had some really awesome cards. The 7790, I think, the like Tahiti cards from AMD. I never had purchased one, but people liked those cards. I did really want like a 6780, I think it was, but I ended up getting the 670 instead, because NVIDIA. Like, this is how they came to rule the market. Like, I knew nothing going in. I wanted AMD, and the guy who was telling me everything about PCs, he's like, no, you don't. You want NVIDIA. And I bought NVIDIA, and I've kind of continued to buy NVIDIA, even though I've always wanted an AMD. So this is how we dig these holes for ourselves. Is that you give all your money to one company, they come up with all the features and technology that you want, and you just keep giving them your money. It's honestly amazing that AMD has pulled out ahead of Intel in today's market. That's something that many people probably could have predicted, but wouldn't have expected, if that makes any sense. But yeah, going back to the chart here, we've got the 3090 Ti. That was probably a pretty pricey card. I think that was like an $1,800 card when it came out, but it's amazing how well that card has held up, especially in comparison to the 3090, which is, a bit lower on the chart, but things really matter at this point in the chart where, you know, you're fighting for that high refresh rate 4K gaming experience. That's really what's going on down here. And so that's where we're at. This is the modern market. Everyone wants these cards. Everyone wants a 5070 Ti. Everyone wants the 7900 XTX has actually remained really affordable. You can find these under 1,000 pretty commonly. But the problem is that the market's gotten really scrunched up. So I mean, yeah, the 3070 is a $300 used card. 6800 XT, that's like a $400 used card. You know what I mean? And that's actually a bargain. 7900 XT, that's like at least an $800 used card in probably most situations. So it's gotten really competitive around this upper tier of performance that all these PC gamers want to be at, and it's just a battle now between the companies trying to bait the consumer in with attractive pricing but extremely limited inventory. And then, we have to consider too that there's just more smaller gains. The performance that we're seeing from the 5090, I think NVIDIA pulled an Intel and they just absolutely juiced the heck out of that chip. You know what I mean? To get that relative performance. I'm guessing it should be much closer to here. Because if you look at the chart, that's the only thing that makes sense. Is that, from the 4090 to the 5090, you'd have it. Oh, you can't see my cursor. Oh no, that's terrible. You can only see the things that well, the point is that there'd be a big chunk lopped off of the 5090's performance. But yeah, they just juiced the heck out of it. They pulled an Intel. So that's what we've got going on with the modern market, and we're not going to see the mid-tier probably catch up to this performance for a long time. I mean, I say a long time, but I mean like 2 to 3 years kind of deal. But the question is affordability, and because the availability, these things are intricately tied together. It just hasn't been there. And AMD is selling a lot more cards. They said, hey, we're selling more cards than we ever expected before. And there's rumors that they're going to come out with a 12 gigabyte version. Rumors, or maybe even more than that, that they're going to have a 12 gigabyte version of the 7080 GRE is what the version is going to be, which I think is a really solid move because that should put them in a really good spot on the relative performance chart here, where we've got the 9070 already here, and so that's going to put us in a really good spot, all things considered, if they come out with that card. And that should be enough VRAM for most games most of the time. Not all games all the time, and that's just the situation we face. Playing Space Marines 2, that actually required 14 gigabytes of VRAM plus some. It had 16 in holding, so you needed a 16 gigabyte card to be playing it at 4K. And I'm not even getting high refresh rates in the game. Not really. Nothing up to 120, which is what my monitor can do. And so I'd probably need even more than that, unless I was using like DLSS or FrameGen or something like that, which is probably what they're expecting people to do to get to those high frame rates. So yeah, I mean that's the modern situation. But from where we've came to where we are, I don't want to say that we've gotten greedy as consumers because hey, the customer's always right, but at the same time, I think that we got to keep fighting this battle, but I think that we also kind of have to accept a little bit of the reality that to some extent we're at the mercy of what these companies can whip out. What TSMC can accomplish, because all these guys are running their manufacturing through them. I'm surprised that we haven't seen some kind of partnership between Intel and another company, I suppose. And maybe they are doing things like that in the background, but Intel is pretty much the only other manufacturer out there, all things considered. They haven't got the process right, it seems, but they have the equipment. That's what matters in that market, and That money's got to go somewhere. All the billions they've invested into the ability to do it, it has to come about. You know what I mean? Like, it has to turn into something. One would hope, one would expect. So I guess we'll see where the market goes from here. Am I saying that Intel's going to come out as some sort of powerhouse in the GPU market? No, I don't think that'll be the case. But I do think that the march of technology is always going to be a fun thing to kind of pay attention to. And I do think that as long as the consumer fights in some sense, that we try our best to control the market. Because when the consumer does that and when they're successful, it often goes very well for us. I mean, just look at what they did to Wall Street, a couple years back. I mean, that was pretty cool, right? So let's stick together, guys. If we feel like we're getting screwed, it's probably because we are. And but at the same time, we'll just try to take the best of what they offer us, I guess, and demand more at the same dang price. That's what we got to do. Just refuse it at any higher price. Like, nope, the demand's there, but not for any higher price. That's my philosophy on it. Because if cards can come out that'll push the market down, that's what we need. And so by refusing to buy cards at scalper prices, by refusing to buy cards that we just don't feel are worthwhile, because look at this relative performance chart and think about what you really need. Think about what you really need to enjoy your game. You know what I mean? Do you need 240 hertz on your 4K monitor? Because there's only like one card on here that could probably do that, maybe two. And they're limiting these features because they know this. If the 3090 had frame gen, do you think anyone would ever buy a 4080? Think about it. Probably not. So so we've got to fight as consumers, but also be, aware of, kind of the relative performance of these things and what we can really expect out of the market. It doesn't take long scrolling here. Look, from the top of the chart, scroll a few times and we're already back to the 5700 XT. I gotta scroll a whole lot to get back towards the start of this chart, but now we're down to the 220 and stuff like that. 640 right here. So yeah, so that's my spiel. That's the card market. That's the relative performance of the Vega 64 in relation to it all. And stay optimistic and hold on to your wallet until the right card comes along, because the margin between these cards is not that big, and we've just got to recognize that. We've just got to realize that the Vega 64 is here, and it would seem like a card you'd never recommend, and it wouldn't have drivers for it. You got to use custom drivers and all this crap, but the top of the chart's up here, from here to here. So it's just not a very big gulf, and it just takes way, way, way more graphics power to accomplish these frames at these high res. So hey, maybe dust off that old 1080p monitor and, the one with the LCD panel you always really dug before you got your upgrade. Yeah, take that thing out of the closet and hook it up to, an old PC and have a blast at 60 hertz. You'd be surprised. Colors are still colors. You're still going to have a good time. Monitors with good motion blur, it's really in the monitor, guys. It really is. So yeah, old tech is awesome tech. You just got to know what you're looking for. But yeah, that's my spiel. So thanks for tuning in. We got a solid almost 25 minutes down here. I think I'm going to end it there. You take care of yourselves. I'll do the same.